Hey, my name is Devin Morgan. I'm the Director of Youth Baseball at Driveline. Very excited to be able to present today for the International Baseball Conference. And what we're going to be talking about is some ideas we have at Driveline relative to youth baseball development, what we call the skills of scale. We really want to think about maximize our ability with younger kids. Just baseball should be fun, but we can do that simultaneously with development of skills of scale, then make it more likely for them to have a viable pathway forward as they transition out of a youth baseball environment into an older amateur, high school, collegiate professional. So what do we really want at the end of the day? At a very basic level, we just want kids to enjoy the game. And again, we want to make sure that we're setting them up for long-term success as opposed to overly optimizing for maximizing our ability to be successful in the current term. We can think about this kind of three different ways. Conceptually, by helping ourselves and our athletes by understanding the difference between younger athletes and older ones. In a technical sense, we start thinking about data and systems that can essentially evaluate where we are right now and then show a pathway for where we want to go. And then structure in terms of the way that we balance off-season training and competition, and even the way that we balance our in-competition phase to try to maximize for as many developmental opportunities as we can. At a basic level, it really helps us to understand the differences between youth athletes and older athletes. I think commonly we tend to understand these differences in the way that they present in terms of strength, coordination, proprioception, fancy word for just talking about how accurate we are at locating our body in space. We tend to under-index, however, for understanding the differences between youth athletes and older athletes relative to the way that they perceive participation and kind of how it makes them feel. Younger athletes at a very basic level have a high attachment to what we call our first principles. First principles, for anybody that's never kind of thought about this before, it's just kind of, again, foundational proposition or assumption that stands alone. What is the main thing that is going to govern all the decision making that we're going to make about a thing or an activity or a sport in this case? Young athletes, the way that they're first principle driven in youth sport tends to revolve around ideas that they want to orient for the things that make them feel good, and they want to orient away for the things that make them feel bad. And in both cases, their perspective on kind of how participation in sport made them feel is defined by essentially how close they got to their desired outcome. Because of this, when you start to mix that idea around other kind of just, again, biological and cognitive differences between young athletes and old ones, it gets a little bit problematic because young athletes struggle generally to have a really good grasp on abstract thought. Developmental psychologist Jean Piaget talks about this pretty extensively. She posited that younger athletes don't even begin to start grasping concepts around abstract thought until what she called the formal operational stage, which happens, it doesn't even start until the age of 11. The way that this kind of impacts young baseball players is they have a hard time not orienting towards very concrete thoughts about their participation. So an example of a concrete thought would be, we won the game and I went 2 for 4. Both of those are just kind of factual, perceived understanding of the outcomes of the game, right? A more abstract thought about baseball would be something in the second example here, where we played hard, and my play today as an athlete is a credit to my hard work. We start getting more in the weeds of like, what does participation in sport actually mean to a young athlete? Again, this gets problematic because of the difference between or how young athletes navigate what participation in sport means to their sense of self, right? Because if you have a young athlete that has that kind of baked-in perception, not only because they're very first principle driven and they want to orient towards what feels them good and away from what makes them feel bad, but also a more biological or a cognitive struggle to really have a firm grasp of abstract thought, leads us to this possibility where a young athlete can go, we lost a game and I'm a loser. That is a thought process essentially defined by concrete thoughts. We did in fact lose the game, but because of my first principle nature and my desire and my hyper incentivization to want to win, I then impart negative feelings about myself because of the outcome of the game. A more nuanced and a more kind of abstract understanding of competition would be the second example. We lost the game. I did my best, and I'm defined by my outputs, not necessarily my outcomes. We'll get more into the output thing in a little bit. we really want to, I think, just, again, recognize the unique needs of younger athletes. One of the ways we can kind of navigate this and set ourselves up for a little bit of success, however, is we start thinking about creating systems that are in consideration of their differences, right? And we can do this both with the way that we just kind of think and consider youth athletes, but also as you start to think about data as it pertains to young athletes. And one way that we can do that is essentially just by establishing the baseline performance, by measuring. We want to measure the stuff that matters right now. And then as they develop those attributes over time, we want to reward and incentivize that development. Generally, what we're taking advantage of is just kind of a concept that we generally refer to as gamification, right? Which sounds a little bit silly, and we're thinking about a game of baseball and having to add in additional gamification concepts. But really what we get into gamification is we want to take advantage of the fact that kids are very familiar with game systems. They're very familiar with an assessment of where they are right now. This happens in school and it happens in their recreational activity and video games. We want to incentivize their progress. We want to lean into their need and desire to want to have their efforts rewarded and affirmed. In practice, what that means is we're constructing feedback loops that pertain to the way that individuals are developing, right? This can happen not only in the short term, whether it's this week or this month or this next 2 months, or over the longer term, starting to take an assessment of where we were when we started at the beginning of the year and look at how much you've gained at the end of the year. And because this is baseball, commonly the way that this is generally understood and the way that we quantify progress is how does it result in the box score? And the box score is really good at being an incredibly efficient way to evaluate kind of the ebb and flow of a baseball game and the outputs therein, but it misses a lot of kind of the outcomes that happen in a baseball game. It doesn't give you as much insight into the outputs. So for example, a young baseball athlete, as they're a hitter, they're up at the plate, they get a pitch to hit, they hit it hard and they hit it far. The outfield happens to be playing them deep. Ball gets caught for an out. And the question is for the adults in the room and for coaches that are around, what type of signal are we sending to that young athlete in that specific instance? Because the choices are very stark. One of those choices is to, I think, to a degree, negatively incentivize what happened for that kid because they made an out. The other opportunity is to understand all of the good things that happens of what they did. They attacked a good pitch to hit. They got off a good swing, and they created pretty ideal bat ball contact that almost created the most valuable outcome that any single swing can create, which is a home run. And even if they didn't hit a home run, what we know that they did is they hit the ball hard and they hit the ball far and they hit the ball in the air. And at the highest level of competition, quite simply, you can look at the statistics, and those are the most valuable outcomes that any kid or any athlete can generate. And at the youth level, when we know that there are really no significant negative stakes on the line in terms of what happens if we lost a game, because coaches at the high school level, the college level, and the professional level generally don't care about the club record of any youth baseball team. What they do care about is how these young athletes develop in terms of their skills and how viable they are for progressing into the next level. So what we want to try to do when we start to thinking about outputs instead of outcomes is provide balance. We want to provide balance for young athletes and for coaches and parents to understand the value of outputs in a way that we can balance against the box score. Again, it helps us to have a really clear idea of what matters the most long-term, right? At Driveline, we have access to a ton of information and data about athletes at the higher levels, but a lot of this stuff is just publicly available now. You can really essentially create yourself a roadmap to understand if I want to be a highly impactful high school baseball player, what sort of skills do I need to have in a technical sense? And how do I just take small bites of that big apple and work towards that as I get closer to high school. As a high school athlete, you can do that for where you want to go to college. And as a college athlete, you can do the exact same thing when it comes to your aspiration of playing professional baseball in some way, shape, or form. Along with essentially creating technical systems where we can essentially figure out where you are right now. We're going to measure the stuff that matters and then provide incentive along the way as you develop those attributes. we are going to figure out whether you're developing positively or not by essentially executing what we call a test and retest model. What that means is figure out where we are right now, train for some amount of time, and then retest those same attributes and say what we developed. And again, with young athletes, it's that test and retest modality gives us the opportunity to reward any amount of developmentally positive progress that they're making in training or in competition. When we start to think about the development of skills at scale, we can go drill a little bit further down the pathway and start thinking about optimal skill development environments, right? And what's a better way to coach younger athletes? The typical way that a lot of baseball coaching has been done for a very long time revolves around the execution of mechanics. We want kids to have good mechanics, right? We want to move the right way. And as coaches and parents, oftentimes we perceive the value of a correct mechanical approach is something that's going to maximize for performance, and it's going to minimize the amount of injury risk or essentially maximize for safety for our young athlete. The problem is that oftentimes the way that kids are coached in this particular fashion ends up with them getting a lot of what we call internal cues. So we're talking about cues that have to do with the internal configuration of your body. Where is your elbow? How still is your head when you're swinging? How are you moving your hips? How are your feet pointing? And oftentimes, a lot of coaches tend to think about these internal cues and the way that athletes should be moving in a correct fashion relative to an athlete that they've perceived to have success with one particular movement solution or another. The problem is that at a biological level, our bodies are so distinct and different from one to the next that a correct movement mechanical position or a set of movement solutions for one person may only be relative to that one person, not for all people. Again, there's all sorts of just biological impediments to any athlete trying to obtain a correct movement solution that essentially was prescribed for one other athlete, just because people are so different. When you start thinking about young athletes, this starts to get really problematic for two reasons. There are research studies that essentially prove that as players start getting more kind of internally focused about executing these internal cues, that it leads to a reduction in motor output. In addition to that, there are even more fundamental problems just have to do with the nature of when we're talking about young athletes as opposed to older amateur or high school athletes, which is there's all sorts of failure points for where my internal cue for one athlete cannot necessarily even be understood and implemented the correct way because the youth player is going to struggle with at least 4 to 5 different failure points. Am I using words as an adult that this young athlete understands? If they know the words, do they even understand them to mean the same thing that they mean to me? As I give a young athlete these type of internal cues, are they even able to execute them, right? Are they going to be able to take the cues that I'm giving them into a new movement solution? If they do that successfully, are they able to understand the difference between the prior movement that perhaps needed some coaching or some correcting and this new movement solution that they've had? And even if they understand the difference between those two things, are they able to take this new movement solution and immediately retain it? Are they able to immediately implement that as like, this is the new field that they're looking for when they're doing something in baseball? And because they're young athletes, you can have failure at some point down the road, and it's just going to cripple the entire process. What we tend to lean towards specifically with young athletes, and even to a degree with older athletes, is what we call external cues, trying to create environments and task and goal within an environment through either constrained or unconstrained positions that allows the athlete to find a solution. The environment is the teacher, and we want to give them the freedom to kind of find a solution that is relative to them and their bodies and gives them as much cognitive freedom as possible. To take this a little bit less into the abstract and more just kind of in terms that we understand, it's very simple things like just asking an athlete to hit a ball to a certain part of the field with a certain part of the cage if we're working. I'm not talking to an athlete about what I might perceive to be the true and correct way to think about hitting the outside pitches to the outer or to the opposite part of the field. I'm telling that athlete the object of this task, of this environment, is to hit the ball to the opposite side of the field. And I want them to find a solution, a movement solution and a cognitive solution that allows them to kind of achieve that task goal. Again, it's simple things like just hit the ball here or throw the ball there. And of course, when we start thinking about throwing or hitting, we're also trying to optimize for motor output as well. And we can think about things like constraints, essentially modified positions or modifications to the drill or the task or within the environment by changing around the implements, positions and goals. What we're looking for is all sorts of different ways that we can try to drive young athletes to more efficient solutions or more optimized or ideal solutions without having to use a bunch of internal cues that not only might fail, but if they are even received correctly, can oftentimes reduce motor output off the table. One of those skills that scales in a very technical sense that we're going to try to monitor for and then execute that test and retest model is exit velocity. Exit velocity is simply a fancy way for talking about how hard the ball is hit. At the highest levels of the game, hitting the ball hard is good. The highest performing batters in Major League Baseball are generally the guys that on average hit the ball the hardest. When we start to thinking about the implementation in youth baseball, when we're monitoring for exit velocity when with younger kids, what we're really thinking about is almost the task output. Whatever your movement solution was, whatever the contact quality was, whatever the bat speed that you brought into that was, what was the output of that bat to ball relationship? How hard did you hit the ball? In order to maximize for the maximal amount of exit velocity or relative to the athlete at any age, it generally necessitates two things at the very least, without getting into kind of the cognitive process of the decision for when and where to put the bat. But again, essentially trying to maximize for exit velocity means that we want to move the bat fast and we want to have maximal amount of bat and ball contact at impact. That's what good hitting is. Good hitting is maximally deploying the bat speed that we bring to the table into really good contact to the ball and having that resolve itself in form of exit velocity. When we start thinking about training for exit velocity, it's really important to understand what that means. If we have a focus in training, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, where we are maximizing for exit velocity, we're trying to raise the peak. And as we bring up the peak, the floor comes with it. And that's the thing that really good hitters do, right? Sometimes hitters are going to get fooled, and sometimes you're not going to be able to get off your A-level swing. You're going to have to get off your B or your C-level swing. You're going to have to make an adjustment. In the ability for you to take that adjustable swing and turn that into a positive outcome is relative to the amount of bat speed that you can still maintain as you're being adjustable. So again, the rising tide raises all ships. Training for bat speed and training for exit velocity peaks isn't just a one-time peak output thing. We bring the floor with it when we take that approach to training. Again, same thing with bat speed. We just know that the best hitters in the world are very, very good at moving the bat very, very fast. We can get a little bit more into the weeds in a technical sense when we start breaking down some of these older ideas about essentially who is responsible for supplying the power when it comes to the collision between a swung bat and a pitched ball. Just the fact of the matter is it's already 10 miles an hour of pitch speed. That results in 2 miles an hour of additional exit velocity. For every 10 miles an hour of bat speed, that represents itself in 12 miles an hour of additional exit velocity. Again, assuming for the same collision efficiency between round ball and round bat. Basically what we're saying is that it matters more that your athletes are moving the bat fast. And when we start thinking about looking at bat speed when it comes to young athletes, I'm a proponent of keeping things really, really simple and really just thinking about bat speed and attack angle are the two things that we're going to look the most at. Again, on the throwing side of things, hey, throwing the ball hard is good. Again, when we start looking at thrown ball velocity, what we are is we're looking at essentially output, right? And for any athlete that is kind of working on developing their mechanics as a young thrower, if they're throwing the ball harder, generally, we can feel fairly confident that they're doing so as a representation of finding a more efficient movement solution or getting stronger or learning how to throw with intent, or some combination of all three of those things. And all of them are good. And the goal that we're looking for all of your throwers is really three things in a perfect world. We're looking for the maximum amount of force production. We want to produce that amount of force with the minimal amount of stress on our bodies relative to the individual athlete. And we always want to have maximal amounts of arm health, because arm health, which we at Driveline look at in terms of a very dogged attachment to a warm-up and recovery program, in addition to a lot of structure around the way that we throw, allows us to make sure that we're always in a healthy position to be able to deploy those two things, right? Maximal force production and minimal amounts of stress relative to the individual athlete when they're throwing the ball hard. In order to be able to do this successfully, we also need to have a mind for structure and execution of this plan relative to kind of an entire calendar year, but then also phases within that year. So for us at Driveline, as it pertains to our academy teams, there's essentially two big phases: the off-season development phase and the in-season competition phase. Off-season training for us is going to be at least about 20 weeks is what we want it to be. And what that means is that we're not doing things like playing fall ball and winter ball. And during that period of time, we're actually stepping away from competition and focusing on kind of well-rounded athlete development. In that off-season developmental phase, we're going to go through essentially four sub-phases: onboarding, a focus on throwing development, a focus on hitting development, and what we call a blend to competition. Basically, we built up all these new toys. We want to make sure that we're able to deploy them in the competition landscape that we have. And then when we get to season, when we get to our competition side of things, we're going to essentially execute really two different phases to our season as it relates to competition. An exploratory phase where we are still trying to maximize for developmental opportunities in competition, and then an actual competition phase where it's at this point, we're making lineup decisions and approaching the game in a way that maximizes our ability to win the game, because winning is good. But we need to make sure that we're doing that in a way that we don't cripple our ability to extract as much developmental opportunity at the early part of our season. So in our off-season development, what that really starts with is what we call a 4-week onboard. In 2020, this year has been so strange for us in the United States in that a lot of places have been able to play games and a lot of places haven't. So some kids are coming to us with very different levels of kind of throwing that they've done over the last 9 to 12 months. So because of that, we want to take that 4-week period of time to kind of gradually reacclimate kids to throwing. One of the things we're going to do during that time, in addition to just like broadly building up their throwing volume, is introducing the things that we're going to be training with for the entirety of the year, which is our plyo throwing balls, throwing overload and underload balls. Is something that we want to kind of have athletes do all the time as part of their warm-up modality before they get ready to train or compete. In addition to, we also are and try to drive as much kind of drill proficiency in the constraint drills we use them in. We have to do some uncoaching sometimes, because a lot of times young athletes are going to come to us with a belief about kind of how they perform, or perhaps faults or failures that they may have that they've just been told to by another adult that they just believe is now a part of them. So we need to kind of uncoach some of that stuff. Doing that 4-week onboard sets us up to be able to go into a throwing development phase. And what that means is essentially over the course of 6 weeks, we're going to throw 3 times a week. 2 of those throwing sessions are going to be what we call more of a recovery modality. We're going to throw it relatively reduced intent. And then 1 day a week, we are going to cut it all the way loose. And we are trying to develop and have our patterns be shaped in this very simple intention action feedback of, I want to throw the ball as hard as possible, and I want to give young athletes the freedom to find a movement solution that accomplishes that. When you start thinking about this type of phase, there's probably at least two different kind of approaches that you can apply to it relative to what the athlete needs. For athletes that essentially just need the stimulus to have the freedom to say that it's okay to move your body really fast and really be a little bit less attached to the idea of where the ball is going to go, then we're going to do some things like shuffle throws. If, however, we're also working with a young athlete who probably needs to benefit from some additional movement pattern efficiency, then what we're going to have them do is throw our plyo overload and underload balls as hard as they can. Because that's the pattern that we're trying to ingrain, is we're trying to ingrain a pattern that is reflective of the benefits of underload and overload training. To get a little bit more in the weeds of that, I think it's just really important to touch on this briefly and understand that when we're throwing overload, what we're doing is we're trying to take of some patterns that are just kind of human biomechanics 101 stuff. This is kind of foundational stuff that Nikolai Bernstein started many, many years ago. In a lot of other countries, the Russians and the Germans were using in Olympic training 50, 60, 70 years ago. This stuff is very well proven. When we're moving overload implements, we're thinking about them. Essentially, what we're trying to drive for is to have the body find a more efficient pattern to move. When we use underload implements or anything less than a 5-ounce baseball, we're trying to drive a supramaximal, trying to drive how fast we can move. And we're going to do all of this in a constrained environment where we alternate from essentially the most constrained drills into the least. So we're going to go from something like a reverse throw that is designed to strengthen and develop strengthen the posterior shoulder, which is really, really good for arm health, into something like a pivot pickoff, which is a constrained lower half, a big focus on hip to shoulder separation and moving the torso very fast when we rotate. Along with that, we're going to have a structure in terms of the volume and the intensity for how we kind of manage those two things. And along the way, we're really giving pretty limited amounts of mechanical instruction. And instead, what we're doing is essentially cueing athletes to throw the ball hard. And we always want to have a target for where we're throwing. Other than the shuffle throws, we always want athletes to be mindful of some type of target that they're trying to work on, just to have them not be just kind of mindlessly going through the drills, but rather doing the drills with intention. And having that intention, being able to move fast or move efficiently while hitting my target. And again, along the way, as a coach or as a parent, it's really important for us to kind of make sure that we're communicating with athletes about how these attributes are developing, and also doing competitions with them, competitions about accuracy, competitions about output, or some combination of both, because both of those things can be developed simultaneously, and both of them are good. Additionally, in our off-season development, we're going to work on some hitting performance. For us at Driveline, we're just huge fans of the AXBAT speed trainer system, whether that's the youth set, which is predicated off being about 20% heavier than the drop 10 standards. So if you have a 30-ounce or 30-inch 20-ounce bat, the speed trainer is going to be about 22, 23 ounces. Again, we're trying to take advantage of just some foundational principles for movement efficiency and strength cultivation when we're swinging overloaded bats, with really, really, really simple goals. Move the bat fast and hit the ball hard. It's a very clear intention action loop, the way that we connect those two things. And for any given athlete, we can train in that environment and scale the task difficulty to meet their needs. Young athletes, a lot of times when it comes to bat speed and training, you can do that in a really easy competition environment. You want to take away any of the inherent fear of failure that they might have when facing a pitcher from 46 feet away, and do a lot of bat speed training in a modified environment. I generally orient away from the tee, but something like side soft toss or kind of flips is a great place for kids to kind of develop a set of movement mechanics and solution and intent that gives them a lot of freedom to move the bat really fast. And then eventually we are going to blend to competition. So we want to start to think about these new tools and skills we've created in terms of thrown ball velocity, bat speed, and exit velocity, and make sure that we're able to deploy those in a competition setting as best we can. And again, even if you think about the fact that we're doing a lot of kind of peak work, we're thinking about peaks of exit velocity, peaks of thrown ball velocity, peaks of bat speeds. All of those things, as we work on the peaks, is pulling the floor up. So if you're the average 11 or 12-year-old boy or girl, and you've done this type of training on exit velocity and bat speed, it could be that you kind of down-regulate and take maybe 10% of your horsepower off the table when you're in competition, because you want to be in control. You want to make sure you get off a good barrel. And maybe that means you take a little bit of motor output off the table. But if your motor output total has been raised because of this off-season training approach, then you're still bringing more fun to the party when you get that swing off or when you throw that pitch in a competition landscape. As we get to competition, because eventually we got to get out of the facility, or we got to get out of training mode, or we have to get into competition mode, we really want to take, I think, a two-phase approach to competition. One is where we go through an exploratory phase. And during that exploratory phase, we are really trying to capitalize on every single developmental opportunity that we have available to us, knowing that The coaches, again, at the highest level of competition and even the levels directly above where we are in the youth space at the high school level, they simply don't care, or they shouldn't care, what the record of your team is. No high school baseball coach is really, really excited to see the game changer statistics of an 11-year-old. It doesn't matter. If that doesn't matter, that should inform our perspective on competition of how we can extract the most valuable out of those experiences. So what we do in our exploratory phase, which is generally going to represent somewhere between 50 to 75% of all the games we're going to play in competition, is I'm trying to maximize the amount of learning that I can do. That learning or developmental opportunity can be in the form of individual things. We're thinking about at-bats or experiences on the mound as a pitcher, or defensive things. Generally, what we want to do is stress test to see what's working and what's not. And if something isn't working, give kids additional exposure opportunities to continue to learn those things. I was on a podcast a couple days ago and was talking about this idea that, when we form teams, a lot of times we probably have a pretty good idea of what kids are going to play in what defensive positions, just because that's generally how it's going to present, right? The best, most athletic kid is generally going to be your shortstop or center fielder or catcher pitcher, and maybe the least athletic kid is going to be relegated to some type of lower leverage position, either in the outfield or maybe second base or something like that. I say that as a former second baseman, so no disrespect intended. If we start making lineup decisions based on that information, though, in January or February or March, that essentially just assumes that I can't teach these kids anything in that same time window. And it could be that the kid that you decide is probably your right fielder in October or November or February is still your right fielder when it comes to maybe May or June. However, if that young athlete is playing right field, once you get to your competition phase where we're playing where you've earned, and they're playing right field, but they're doing so with exposure opportunities and learning opportunities that took place because we gave them opportunities to pitch. We gave them opportunities to play shortstop. They're taking the positional task demands of that high leverage position into their other place. And they're connecting with this idea that, oh, I can't fall asleep in right field because I know what happened when I kind of approached shortstop play that way. And when I was playing shortstop, I had to have a plan. I had to be dialed into every pitch. I had to be communicating with my teammates. If you take that perspective from some experience at shortstop, regardless of what the outcome was in terms of competition, and you take that with you to another defensive position on the field, it's just going to make you a better baseball player. And again, at the end of the day, I think that there's really two things that benefit us the most. One is to just truly understand the fact that there's no amount of success at the youth baseball level that's going to guarantee any continual success in the future. There's no way that you can kind of front load all of this stuff for young kids and just presume that you're going to be able to lock up the thing that you're valuing most when a child is 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. There's nothing that a 12-year-old that's going to do that's going to guarantee a D1 scholarship. That's just not a thing. Because of that, for us at Driveline, when it comes to what we do for youth players, it gives us all the freedom in the world to approach ideas about skills at scale and future viability. One, when it comes to kids, hitting the ball hard is fun. Throwing the ball hard is fun. Doing those things repeatedly is fun. Having adults and coaches and parents that are able to send signals in context to incentivize kids' development. And certainly the box score is great, and kids want to win. Kids need to win. And when that happens, we want to celebrate that. At the same time, we also want to celebrate all of the output related things that might not directly show up in a box score that are also wins. Having a high intent throwing mechanics and putting something in the zone competitive against a good pitcher or against a good hitter, and because it was in the zone, you got beat and you gave up a hit. Hey, that's great. If you threw the ball 2 miles an hour higher than you've ever thrown before, that tells me that you're throwing with high intent and you're controlling it and you're learning how to sprint by sprinting. It is incredibly valuable for young athletes to get really, really good at moving fast. And again, being able to do so gives us the opportunity to have a little bit of better feeling about future viability. We start to think about the way that young athletes present at the next level of competition, which is probably for us in the United States, high school baseball. It's really two different versions of a player. One, you could have a player that has a really refined set of skills. And if they lack motor output at the same time as they're trying to fight with older players, sophomores, juniors, and seniors for playing time, they're always going to be behind the curve. And there's no amount of smoothing out to that player's game that's going to change the fact that they're fundamentally deficient in really core skill attributes and motor output that other athletes have. And as that player trying to make up that ground, everybody else is getting better. On the other hand, the player that we think about presenting to a high school baseball coach is someone that's already ahead of the curve when it comes to power output, someone that's already ahead of the curve when it comes to skills of scale and stuff that plays as athletes transition to a 90-foot field. It could be that it takes some time to smooth those things out, but that opportunity to smooth them out from the ages of 14 to 15 to 16 is in line with their biological trends for increased coordination and just body awareness and strength at the same time. And as soon as you start to smooth those edges out, you have a player that can have an impactful experience on a 90-foot baseball field. And that is the thing that we optimize for the most.